Okay, welcome to the conference on the wisdom of the crowd, or the wisdom of crowds. I'm Stergios Skaperdas, the interim director of the Institute for Mathematical Behavioral Sciences. The institute is located in social sciences, and we have many mathematical psychologists, cognitive scientists, economists, political scientists, anthropologists, sociologists, as well as mathematicians and computer scientists who are involved in the institute. It tries to facilitate research that uses mathematical methods and usually interdisciplinary research. And we have weekly colloquium, lunches, have conferences like this one, technical reports, and other ways of facilitating research, interdisciplinary research in the area. And this is an example of the kind of conference we facilitate and organize. And this is the second one we had this year. And I would like to welcome all the speakers, all the other attendees, and thank Mark and Michael and Janet who have organized the conference. And I'm an economist myself. This is a topic that someone who used to be called a moral philosopher, but came to be known as an economist, first talked about. I guess Adam Smith talked about through the invisible hand about the wisdom of crowds. And since then, this is a topic that is of interest for social sciences and behavioral sciences since then. And I'm looking forward to the conference. And Mark will make some other introductory remarks.
Well, thank you, Stergios, and thanks IBS for hosting this conference and sponsoring the conference. Very nice. I want to say welcome to the speakers. So one appealing feature of the wisdom of crowds research is that it's so interdisciplinary. Economists study this in sort of game theoretic settings. They study prediction markets. Computer scientists often study this from a crowdsourcing perspective, how to sort of get workers to do simple tasks on crowdsourcing platforms like Amazon's Mechanical Turk. Another sort of connection that we won't talk about very much here is to robotics as well as engineering. If you have different sensors or agents picking up different signals, different perspectives of the same environment, how do we fuse all these signals together? Within psychology, it's studied a lot by social psychologists. How do people communicate with each other and exchange information? What are the social processes that take place? The JDM community, of course, has been doing and is still doing a lot of research on the wisdom of crowds. How can we combine judgments? How do we extract judgments? Communicate judgments with other people? And people like Bill, Michael, and myself, sort of mathematical psychologists, cognitive scientists interested in computational models, are interested in understanding internal representations and new ways to combine judgments. So another appealing feature for me of wisdom of crowds research is that it spans very different styles. So you can do very deep theoretical research, very mathematical, statistical work. At the same time, you can do very good applied empirical work. As my wife explains to me, she's very happy that I finally seem to be doing something useful.
All right. Well, as Mark was saying, well, first of all, I'm really delighted to be here and have an opportunity to present this work to this audience. I'm really looking forward to all of the talks and also just for all the great stimulating discussion and getting some feedback on this work. So my own background is do work on the psychology of judgment and decision making, so maybe kind of halfway between the more applied and the more mathematical. You can tell me once you see it, I suppose. And our twist on this is that crowds are great. There is wisdom of the crowds sometimes, but that small crowds are better. And so what I hope to do is convince you of that. Of course, you have to choose the small crowd carefully, so not just any small crowd. And this is work with my collaborators, Al Manis at Wharton School and my colleague Rick Larrick at Duke. Okay, so I'll start out just by telling you about a tournament that the Wall Street Journal runs every year. And they basically ask about 50 economists from academia, from industry, from government, to make forecasts about a whole bunch of different economic variables. And then at the end of the year, they write an article about how the tournament went. Especially they focus on the winners of the tournament. And so back in 2009, this article was written at the beginning of 2010 talking about the tournament. And the winners were Richard Berner and David Greenlaw, and they interview them and they ask them, well, how were you able to see a little bit more than everybody else was able to see this past year? And in this case, they usually have a very compelling explanation. These guys work at Morgan Stanley, and their analysts at Morgan Stanley were able to just do much better analysis than anyone else, and they were able to make better predictions. So then we could jump ahead. Well, actually, before we jump ahead, they asked Berner and Greenlaw, they asked the winners of the tournament to make their predictions for the following year, because everybody, of course, wants to know what these guys think is going to happen over the next year, since they won this contest among the best economists that there are who are providing the forecasts. And so Berner and Greenlaw predicted that by the fourth quarter, they predicted gross domestic product will rise 3.2%. They predicted lower unemployment. And they made many predictions. These are just some of them. So we could jump ahead to the next year, because this is all historical data. We could look at the Wall Street Journal article the following year, right? And what happens the following year? So what happened in 2010? The winner of the tournament was Paul Ashworth. And it's quite interesting, because if you read the article, nowhere in the article does it say anything about Berner and Greenlaw. They participated in the contest. It's not like they decided to retire, and sort of rest on their laurels. They participated. They're just not mentioned anywhere in the article. Remember, 50 economists, and why is that? Well, they finished 26th. And in fact, this tournament hasn't been going on that long. Well, before I get to that, let me just tell you about this last year. Arun Raha was the winner for predicting 2012. And then here's the question we can ask ourselves. Do you want to bet on Raha for 2013? You can see his predictions there, just a couple of them for GDP growth and for unemployment. Or do you want to go on the mean forecast? Because they all bet on the mean forecast. Because they also tell you that. They tell you what is the mean or the median of all of the economists participating in the tournament. And it's a rhetorical question, because you probably know the answer. Okay, a couple of facts. So first of all, in 2012, this is the first time the Wall Street Journal did this. For the very first, they've been running this for a few years. For the first time, they actually tell you what place would have the average forecast come. So out of, I think there were 48 economists, and then plus they had the average, so 49 including that. The average would have come in 12th place. So you wouldn't have beat everybody by going with the average, but you would have been sort of in the upper quartile. The second fact is here are Raha's previous finishes out of 50. One year he came in 47th. 1 year he came in 20th. He was in the middle of the pack, right? So the fact that Arun Raha did really well in predicting 2012 at least couldn't have been anticipated by looking at his performance in recent years in which he was at best average. And in fact, we can look at the past 4 years of winners. Berner and Greenlaw in 2010. The next year, they came in 26th. Ashworth won in 2011. I showed you that one. He came in 32nd. Actually, for 2012, the winners were Levins and Gill. They actually came in. Sometimes it's going to happen, right? Even if it's completely random and your rank is just pure luck. I mean, these guys have skill, but maybe they all have the same skill, meaning their rank is luck. Even if it's purely by chance, sometimes they're going to do well a couple of years in a row. So Levins and Gill and Arun Raha, we'll have to wait. We'll have to wait and see. Okay, so this sort of gives the intuition that maybe these guys are all similarly skilled. Maybe it's just luck who happens to come in first place. And really what we ought to be doing, you can't, any given year, maybe somebody's going to beat the composite, somebody's going to beat the average, but maybe, you're going to do pretty well if you average. You're going to be maybe in the upper 20, 25%. Maybe that's the best that we can hope to do. And so that's sort of the intuition behind, some of the intuition anyway, behind why averaging is so powerful. There was a book that came out a few years ago, which I'm guessing many, if not all of you know about this book. It's basically extolling the wisdom of crowds. So when you've got a lot of different opinions, what you really want to do is average or combine them in some way. So all our thinking around this revolves around a concept that we call bracketing. And I'm just going to illustrate it with a simple example, and that's what I'll use to sort of develop a lot of the analysis and examples and data that I show you. So for example, what will be the high temperature in Honolulu tomorrow might be a question that some people get, and I'll just work through a simple two-person example so you can sort of get the intuition for this. The goal is to be as close to the truth as possible. So in all of our work, we use an absolute distance measure as a measure of accuracy. And so there's two possible cases. One case is that the estimates fall on opposite sides of the truth. Right? So here somebody says 70, another person says 90, and we could look up the truth once we know it, 78. Let's suppose, so in this case, person 1 misses by 8, person 2 misses by 12, the average individual misses by 10, but the average of the two guesses is 80, right? So it's a lot closer to the guess. The average is much closer than the average individual. And so this is sort of a standard comparison. How well does averaging compare to just picking somebody at random, which is the average individual? And if estimates fall on opposite sides of the truth, then it has to be the case that averaging is going to beat the average individual. Right? So that's just logically has to be true. And what happens if they're on the other side? Well, in that case, the average individual again misses by 10 for the numbers I have here. The average of the two guesses is also 68. That also misses by 10. If they're on the same side of the truth, averaging is accurate as the average individual. So just logically, it has to be the case that if you combine across both sorts of cases where you have bracketing and cases where everybody's on the same side and you don't have bracketing, averaging has to do at least as well as the average individual. And across a series of judgments, you're typically going to get some bracketing somewhere along the line, if not a lot of bracketing, and therefore averaging, by and large, has to beat the average individual. You can have extreme cases where it's the same as the average individual, but it's always the case that everybody is on the same side of the truth. Okay, so that's the measure that we're going to use is bracketing. Where does it come from? Judges are more likely to bracket when they have different samples of experience. So these are all the things that lead to independence and errors. That underlies bracketing as well. Bracketing is very much related to things like, it's related to correlation and errors, but it's also related to sort of systematically being biased higher or low. So having different samples of experience, seeing different things, people having different trainings. So economists might come from different schools of thought, different theories, people having access to different information. All these things lead to bracketing. One important point, when people start to talk to each other, they tend to anchor on each other's opinions. They tend to form sort of a shared perspective, and this tends to kill bracketing. So people sort of forming independent judgments is sort of one of the things that really will help get bracketing in a group. So across studies, we found that people tend to if you just take any, I think of this as a pairwise measure. So across studies, we found that bracketing rates are around 30% to 40% of the time, any random pair of people. And that yields, if you're just averaging two estimates, that leads to an error reduction of about 15 to 20%. If you just have two people whose errors are independent, bracketing is going to be 50%. Right? So for any two people, probably, unless you have negatively correlated errors or something, 50% is a very good number for a pair of people to bracket. OK, so another thing we like to do is sort of compare strategies. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about several different strategies. One strategy is you average everybody. Another strategy is what we call chase the expert. You try to, and this is very intuitive to people, right? That you try to figure out who knows the most about a given problem, and you go with that person's opinion, right? So one question I think is sort of when is it a good idea to average, and when is it a good idea to chase the expert? And I'll talk a little more about this later, but people sort of have a default, a bias perhaps, toward trying to identify expertise and chase the expert. So averaging beats chasing when differences in individual accuracy are small or moderate. If you have huge differences in accuracy, then you might be better off chasing. The bracketing rate is relatively high. So for any pair of people, relatively high, I mean, let's say at least 25, 30%. We could call that diversity of errors. And also, the better judge is hard to identify in advance. So actually, it could actually be the case that you can identify the better judge easily, but the differences in expertise are small enough that you're still better off averaging. But by and large, chasing, the chances that chasing is going to be a better strategy tend to go up if you can sort of know for sure who is the best judge. OK, so then averaging sounds great. Why not just average all the time? What's the problem with averaging? Yeah.
I wanted to ask about the bracketing. Does that hold up across quite a long range of different kinds of predictions? For instance, high temperature, middle temperature?
Yeah, so we found, I mean, it varies by type of question. So some question sets you have lower bracketing on the order of 15%. Others we see more, 40 to 50%. And in fact, I'll show you some economic time series data from actual economists predicting variables where the main determinant of bracketing and economic forecasting appears to be sort of how far into the future you're predicting. Right? If you're predicting farther into the future, you're going to see a lot less bracketing if you think about these variables as sort of following a random walk. Yeah, so it does vary. And I think an interesting question is, can we sort of anticipate it in advance? So what's wrong with averaging? It sounds great. Well, you might encounter, so this is a forecaster from the Wall Street Journal survey. And one problem with averaging is you could have certain people who are just really bad forecasters, and they really pollute your pool. So this guy, Mark Nielsen, 1 year he finished second to last. Another year he finished last. Another year he jumped up to 17th. And then this recent year he finished last again. And he's now predicting 3.4% inflation for 2013. Well, maybe he's a contrarian. Maybe that's a good thing. We could talk about that later, perhaps. Now, one thing that the Wall Street Journal does is not only do they interview the person who comes in first place, they also interview the person who comes in last place. So here's what he says. So I love the part where he says, we're sticking to our guns on that, even though the markets don't seem to agree with us. So he's making great forecasts, just the world somehow is not cooperating. All right, so here's the small crowd strategy. And our proposal is, maybe there's some sort of middle ground strategy where you can get the benefits of averaging, of aggregation, but at the same time, you can avoid people like this one guy sort of polluting the pool, avoid the worst judges. So the idea is you use any Q to expertise, any Q to find an expert, and one of the things we'll be looking at are, well, can you use very recent history? So how did your forecasters do last quarter, for example? You pick 5, so for example, and we're going to look at one where you sort of rank order the forecasters, and you just sort of take the top 5, and then you average them. And there's a few benefits to this. One benefit which I'll show you, is it turns out to be pretty accurate. In fact, sometimes a lot of the time it actually beats the whole crowd. It doesn't always, but it turns out to be pretty accurate. Another benefit is it's robust, in that if it's not the best thing to do in a given environment, it tends to be pretty close. So one problem with chasing is you might get the wrong person, and that's a bad strategy. But averaging the whole crowd can be a bad strategy too if there's some bad judges messing things up. Whereas the small crowd strategy, I'll show you, has this benefit that it's robust and it seems to work well most of the time, if not all of the time. If it's not best, at least it might be second best. And then another benefit is it is psychologically appealing. So we have some of our work shows that people don't understand averaging. They don't trust sort of the wisdom of crowds because they think if you just sort of average opinions, you'll get sort of average results. It's like picking a person at random, or you get mediocrity, which is sort of the worst that it can do. Whereas we have some work which I hope to get to show you one of the studies that the people find small crowds to be appealing because on the one hand, they've got they're confident they've got a good set of experts. They're not worried about bad judges polluting the pool. But at the same time, they might be nervous. Can they really identify the best judge? And so this particular strategy of small crowds seems to be something that people say, oh yeah, that's not a bad idea. I can imagine doing that. All right, so I'm going to get to some data.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So this is, your small crowd strategy is kind of a special case of giving some people more weight than other people.
Yeah.
Namely, you give 5 people full weight and
Exactly.
everybody else 0.
Yeah, exactly.
So have you tried?
We haven't yet, and the question would be, we could think of like a weighted average, and the question is how to come up with the weights. You've got 50 forecasters. You need a tremendous amount of data if you're going to use regression weights. Otherwise, you have some out of sample problems. So that's probably not going to be what we're doing here, I don't think. But there might be a function where you put some differential weighting, you could do a little bit better. Sure. Yeah.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Definitely, I had a similar question about weighting, but if you don't have as clear-cut of indicators as that, I know in economic reports, a lot of times they'll use median forecasts. Have you looked at winds arising in your data?
Yeah, so we've looked at, So let me show you the results, and then I'll tell you what happens with the medians.
Okay.
Medians can help, all right, but the short answer is that it's a separate question. The bump up you get from small crowds is better than more than the bump up you get from medians.
Well, I guess my real question is, what is the significance of 5 as opposed to like 15 or 20 or 25?
Yeah, I'll show you. Hang on. No, 5 is nice because it's easy to remember, a simple heuristic. If you want to, you can watch the whole talk. If you say 7 at the end, I'll be pretty happy. So it's a flat maximum. Yeah.
Then there's the Dave Brubeck song also. Take 5. It's also.
Okay. Survey of Professional Forecasters was run now by the Philadelphia Fed. This is just a really fun data set to play with. It was started in 1968, so it goes back a long way, by the National Bureau of Economic Research and American Statistical Association. And I have 2 different errors here because in 1990 it was taken over by the Fed, by the Philadelphia Fed, and the number of forecasters in the pool, started. It was about 50 in the early era. And then it dropped down to like 5 or 6. It dropped down pretty low for a few years, and then it went back up when the Philadelphia Fed took over. And since we're pooling lots of forecasts, what I want to do is basically, and the easiest thing to do is just to split it into 2 separate eras, which we could look at separately. 30 to 50 forecasters each quarter. The forecasters are anonymous, so we don't know who they are, although apparently there's some overlap with the ones who are in the Wall Street Journal. But they do have ID numbers, so we could track them over time. They come from academics, government, and financial institutions. This data set has 32 economic variables. So far, we've managed to look at 7 of them, and we'll try to power through the rest of them later. The forecasts are over 5 horizons. So they predict the end of the current quarter. In the middle of a quarter, they'll predict the end of the current quarter. They'll predict the second quarter, the third quarter, the fourth quarter, and then the 5th quarter. They'll predict like a full 13 months ahead. So 5 horizons. So here are the data sets that we looked at. And it's 50 because for each variable, there's 2 eras. And in each era, there's 5 forecast horizons. Right? So we looked at each of these data sets separately. And you could sort of see what they are there. There's GDP, nominal GDP, housing starts, a whole bunch of interesting ones. And I just have some sample values that you can sort of see how things may have changed over the years. And about 3,200 individual forecasts per data set. So here's what we did. We looked at each of these separately. Each period, we ranked the forecasters based on their accuracy over recent history. In most cases, it was absolute deviation, though we used absolute percentage error in the case of the trending variable, which was nominal GDP. And we based it on performance for predictions of the same variable on the same time horizon. So at least in this analysis, I'm going to show you everything is treated as sort of an individual data set, all 50 of them. And we just applied the strategies. So here are the results. So in this graph, on the left, on the x-axis, you have the size of the crowd. How many experts are you picking? On the left, you pick one person. And on the right, you take the average of the whole crowd. And then you could see that there's different crowd sizes. So they're ranked, so you could take any number, top 5, top 10, whatever you want. The y-axis is the percentage improvement over picking a judge at random. Right? So all the data sets are sort of put on the same scale. And here's the legend is for history. So the black line is the percentage improvement you get. If you just take judges, you randomly rank them. You have zero history. You just randomly pick judges. And of course, more is always better. It starts to asymptote. It looks like around 20 or maybe a little higher, maybe a little bit higher than that. And the red line is if you have a history of only one. And then you rank order them, and you just take the judge who did best on the last forecast period. The blue line is if you have a history of 5. So you actually rank them based on their average performance over the last 5 judgment trials. And I drew a line there for top 5. One thing to note is that the small crowd does better than the whole crowd. There's a few. It's about 2 to 3 percentage points higher in terms of percentage improvement over picking a random judge. There's a lot of improvement actually just from a history of 1, which I found kind of surprising. Just by ranking them based on 1 judgment trial led to some benefits, and then better if you have a history of 5. In this particular data, you can see it's sort of flat. Anything between, I think it maxes out at 11 judges. Anything between 5 and 15 is about the same. In this data set. I'm going to show you some simulations and some more data why I particularly like the number 5. But again, if you want to walk away saying 8, I'm OK with that. The median, I think somebody asked about the median. If you take the median of the whole crowd, it might go up by maybe be better by about 1 to 2 percentage points. So it is better in this data set, the median. I think the average of the mean median is not quite as good as the median in this data set. But one thing that we found in looking at all of this data is that, first of all, the bump up from the small crowd is bigger than the bump up from going with the median. And the second thing is these seem to be 2 separate questions. So if the median gives you a little bit of a bump if you go with the whole crowd, it's also giving you a little bit of bump if you go with the small crowd. So you could apply both of them at the same time. OK. And another cut at the data, we could also look at predictions for different time horizons.
Although it would seem maybe the variance would go up if you're taking a median of only 5 people as opposed to the median of the whole crowd.
Yeah, it could. Yeah, that's so another thing we might be interested in is not only the percentage improvement that you get, but sort of the variance around that. I'll have a little bit to say about that soon. Yeah.
Jack.
Yeah.
How long was the training period? Basically, the time that you used to determine who were the.
Oh, right. So, in the case of the red line is just a history of 1 trial. Yeah, just the last quarter or the last forecast. But the blue line is a history of 5. So the 3 lines represent 0 history, history of 1, and history of 5. And the results hold up also for each horizon. Now, one thing that happens over time is I have the bracketing rate for any pair of judges in that first row. And that, as we would expect, that goes down over time. The future just becomes, people tend to be more on the same side of the truth if these variables are sort of random walks. And so the percentage improvement sort of goes down over time. But what seems to be robust in this, across every single time period, a small crowd beats the whole crowd. It is kind of interesting that that for the longer histories, it seems that a history of longer horizons, a history of 1 is just as good as a history of 5. So I look forward to, I don't know if this is something that's stable. I'd be curious to know your intuitions about that perhaps later. But that does seem to be the case, that the big difference in history seems to show up early. Yeah?
Do you have, for most of the forecasters, do you have a history of 5, or does it?
Yeah, no, so what happens is they come in and out of the pool. And so what we do is we basically, so it's really not a history of 5 here, it's probably more like a history of 3, because we just look at their performance when they were present. And we rank them based on that. So as long as they showed up at least one time, just to be sort of conservative, we said, you know, you can still be ranked. Yeah. Okay, so the second study is a simulation. And what we wanted to do here was get a handle on under what conditions are these different strategies going to work well. Is it the case that the small crowd strategy just works well sometimes, but most of the time you're better off with the whole crowd? Or is there something to this strategy that makes it very, very interesting compared to other possibilities? So here we vary the environment. So I'm going to show you simulations for a pool of 50 judges who are making forecasts over 110 periods. We systematically varied whether they were similar or different in expertise, so how much dispersion is there in the accuracy of the judges. And also we varied whether or not they make same or similar errors. We varied the bracketing rate as well. And on each period, errors for the current period are generated, and then we rank the judges based on their errors for the previous H periods, where history could be 1, 2, 3, and so on. So here's some more details on this. We assumed that the judges were unbiased but had error. So for this simulation, we used a truth plus error model. Each judge has normally distributed error, so that each judge has a MAD score. So on average, the MAD is sort of on average, how far is that judge from the truth? And turns out that it didn't really, we just ended up, I'll show you the simulations for a uniform distribution. The shape of the distribution doesn't seem to matter a whole lot. We set the average MAD at 100. And then each judge is randomly assigned a skill level where lower is better here, right? Lower absolute distances are better from the distribution. And so a key parameter is going to be the coefficient of variation of this distribution. So it's just the standard deviation over 100 in this case. And I'll show you. And we also varied the bracketing rate, which we controlled in this case by pairwise correlation. Since they were all unbiased, all we needed was correlation to get this to work. All right, so just to get a sense of what these different environments look like, this is a distribution for a low dispersion environment. Judges are similar. The coefficient of variation is 10%. The worst judge misses on average by 82. By 117, and the best by 82. Here's sort of a moderate environment where the worst judge is 3 times as bad as the best judge. Right? The range is 48 to 152. Everybody gets sort of a random sample from that distribution. And then finally, here's a high dispersion environment. The worst judge is much, much worse than the best judge. All right? So we really looked at a wide range of possibilities for dispersion. Oh, so where would you like to start? I'm going to pluck out a few interesting cases from this that are sort of representative, and they're going to be sort of have parameter values similar to ones that we see in actual data. All right, so the first is going to be a case where judges have similar expertise, but they also have diverse errors. So the coefficient of variation is low at 15%. Judges are similar, but there's a relatively high bracketing rate. The black line is what happens if there's no history. More is always better. The y-axis is still the same. It's always going to be percentage improvement over random. The dotted line is if you have an infinite history, right? So you actually know what are the true ranks. And then we could look at the performance of picking 5 judges in this environment. So that's the top 5. And in this particular environment, it's best to go with the whole crowd. Right? Because you have, unless you have a lot of history, but let's take a representative case where you have a history of 5. The whole crowd is the best way to go. And why is that? Well, there's 2 things that are kind of pushing in that direction. you have low coefficient in variation, so it's not the case that some judges are much more expert than others, and so that's going to push in favor of going with the whole crowd. The second is that the high bracketing rate is really high, and so when judges tend to fall on opposite sides of the truth, errors tend to cancel out, and that's going to favor including more and more judges. So both of these things favor the whole crowd here. But one thing to notice is that the small crowd's not bad, right? It's a lot closer to the whole crowd than if you look at the blue line, which is history of 5. It's closer to going with the whole crowd than with chasing, which is all the way on the left. And so that's going to kind of be the thing that's going to make this work, is that small crowd, if it's not the best thing to do, it's closer to the best thing to do than the worst thing to do. Here's another case. There's a range of expertise, so the coefficient of variation is 40%, a lot of bracketing. In this case, the high coefficient of variation is going to favor chasing. That's going to push you to the left of this diagram, because there really are a few judges out there who are much better than others. The high bracketing rate, on the other hand, is going to push toward the whole crowd, and the balance of those two is going to mean that the small crowd is best. And so you can see it sort of peaks, I don't know, around 9 or 10 for history of 5. Another thing you can sort of notice in these pictures is that there's diminishing returns to history. So it's good to get more history on the judges, but by the time you get to 5, you've got most of the benefits, and it helps to get 10 or to go further up. But the best you can ever do in this case, with this strategy anyway, is that dotted line at the top. Another type of environment, judges are similar and make similar errors. So the low coefficient of variation is going to push in favor of going with the whole crowd. The low bracketing rate, on the other hand, the fact that they tend to be on the same side of the truth, is going to favor chasing, and so the small crowd is best in this situation if you sort of balance those out. And again, it seems like around 5 or 6 is the best here. And then finally, there might be, these are the cases where wisdom of crowd, this is the kind of case where chasing works really well, that you have a wide range of expertise and you have very little bracketing. And so the whole crowd actually is terrible here compared to if you just pick the person who has done well recently. So both factors here, high coefficient of variation, a lot of dispersion and expertise, that favors chasing. Low bracketing favors chasing as well. And so if we put all of these together and look at our different environments, we have one environment where you have similar judges and a lot of bracketing. That's going to favor the whole crowd. Another environment where you have similar judges, very little bracketing. Seems like small crowd is best there. Another environment, small crowd is best because you have both, you have a lot of bracketing, but you also have a lot of dispersion and ability. And then finally, there's an environment in which chasing is best because there's a lot of differences in expertise, but the bracketing rate is really low. So in some cases, wisdom of crowds is the best thing you could do of these strategies. In a lot of cases, actually, on the main diagonal, small crowd is the best thing to do. And then finally, there's some environments in which chasing the expert really is the best that you can do. And the thing to notice is that the small crowd, even when it's not the best thing to do, it's not bad. It's actually closer to the best thing to do than to the worst thing to do. So here there was some main results of these simulations. Small crowds are robust. They work well across a wide range of environments. It's not the best, it's close to it. The other two pure strategies are not robust. Sometimes they work well, but sometimes they don't. The other thing that I think, to me, was kind of surprising is that you don't really need much history in order to make this work. The reason is because if there's low dispersion, if judges are similar, it just doesn't matter who you pick, right? So you need a lot of history to really identify the better judges in that case, but it really doesn't matter a lot because they're similar in ability. But if there's high dispersion, it turns out it's really easy to identify the better judges with a short history. And one last slide on the simulations. Another thing that sort of surprised me is the strategy is not terribly sensitive to the size of the pool. And so this is sort of averaging across all 99 environments. So you have to make some assumption about how the environments are distributed. With 50 judges, it turns out top 5 is best. But if you only had 25, maybe it would be top 4. If you had 100 judges, maybe it would be top 6. So it seems like every time the pool size doubles, maybe you add a person. And my guess is by the time you got to 15 judges, you'd kind of have extracted all the benefit that you could get anyway. But it seems like relatively small crowd sizes on the order of 5 to 10, if you want to sort of pick a range, are going to be pretty robust and are going to work across a wide range of sizes of the pool. Okay, how am I on time? Okay. So we also looked at data from psychology experiments. These are questions where people answer a lot of trivia questions, and we can apply our strategies to these experiments as well. We looked at 40 of them. In the interest of time, I'll skip through some of the details. Similar mechanics, although this time it's not a time series, so we can just randomly order the questions over and over again, just to make sure we're not sort of getting noisy results. So we looked at each data set. We had 10,000 runs taking different random orders of questions. Applied the strategies exactly the same as before. And so this is broken down by the size of the pool. And so for the small pools, these are ones with fewer than 20 judges. About top 5 appear to be the best strategy. And you can see there's just a big drop if you go to the whole crowd. If you rank people based on 5, you're doing almost twice as well in terms of percentage improvement. Very similar story for the other size pools. It's always the case that some small crowd seems to, in all of our data, is better than going with the whole crowd. We also categorized the different data sets. Here we could do it. It's harder to do for the economic data sets. We categorized them based on do they have low dispersion, a relatively low CV, or high, and we categorized them based on bracketing. Just to look and see, did we get what the simulations told us we should get? And there were 7 data sets where we expected the whole crowd to do well, and in those data sets, it did.
But Jack, I'm confused.
Yeah.
Did you categorize your subjects based on some of their answers and then use them to predict other answers?
No, I'm sorry. So we basically just took each of the data sets. And they're always the same domain. So each data set might be guessing the prices of different pizzas in Ann Arbor, Michigan was one of the data sets. Or how many games did NHL teams in hockey win the previous season? That kind of thing. And then we sort of just on each run of the simulation, we would treat it as if it were a time series, rank them based on, let's say, on a history of 5, on the 5 previous questions, and then look at how well they did take the top 5, look how well they did in the 6th question, and then for the next question we did the same thing, but it's always sort of a rolling history, so it's always based on what happened recently. There were some environments where we expected small crowd to be best, so these were ones where the judges were similar and there's low bracketing. Small crowd was best here. Again, the blue line is a history of 5. There were some environments where, again, we expected this small crowd to be best. Lots of differences in ability, but high bracketing. Turns out that, small crowd was best, maybe not as few as we thought, but small crowd was still best there. And then finally, there were some environments where judges were very different from each other in ability, not much bracketing. And in those data sets, we expected chasing would be the way to go. And in fact, that's sort of what we saw. So this is just sort of a confirmation that the simulation's at least capturing something about reality, that you could take these 2 dimensions, categorize a task or a data, an economic, if we had that for the economic data sets or these trivia questions, categorize the environment, and that can give us a pretty good idea of which strategy is going to work the best. But I think the important thing is that even if you're in one of these environments in which small crowds is not the best thing to do, it still comes pretty close. And oftentimes we don't know what kind of environment we're in. I think we're often facing environments, where we don't really know, do we have a high dispersion in ability or a low dispersion in ability? We don't really know much about bracketing. In those cases, which I think comprise a lot of the situations we face, I think that small crowd is a pretty good bet. So I think I'm pretty close to the end on here. So across all 90 data sets, I could sort of award for each data set like a gold medal to the best of these peer strategies, a silver medal, and a bronze medal, or last place. Booby prize. So in all of these cases, the small crowd strategy I'll look at has 5 judges and a history of 5, just to keep things stable and comparable. So the whole crowd, basically, of these 3 strategies, whole crowd, chasing, or small crowd, it was kind of all over the place, often comes in second. If there's any one lesson from our research is that chasing is probably a bad thing to do. chasing the expert. It came in last place on 6. This is across the economic data sets and the trivia questions, right? So the results are very similar in those two sets. We see very, very similar results. Chase the expert typically comes in last place. Small crowd, it actually wins more than the other strategies. So if you had to pick something to bet on, it's the best bet. And when it doesn't win, it comes in second. So it's very rarely the worst thing to do. So I was going to tell you a little bit about the fact that people like this, but I think maybe I should...
We could do that in discussion.
We could do that in discussion. OK. So small crowds are robust, just to wrap up. Have a relatively high average performance and low variance performance, and they almost never come in worst. The robust is something I'll call strategy drift, which means that you could, my recommendation is small crowd of, take the average of the small crowd of 5. If you decide to do 3 people, 4 people, 7 people, 8 people, it's not going to matter very much. It's a flat maximum. If you decide to take the median instead of the mean, it might be a little better or a little worse. It's not going to matter a whole lot. So if you deviate from whatever the prescription turns out to be, it's a flat maximum. It's no big deal. These other strategies, chasing and whole crowd, I would say, are not robust. There are times when they work extremely well, but there's also times when they work extremely poorly. We found that history of 5 works really well with 5 judges. Here's the point I'll just assert. People seem to like small crowds and seem willing to use them. This idea is sort of psychologically appealing, whereas averaging the whole crowd is much less appealing to people. So our advice to the Wall Street Journal, celebrate not just one person, but the top 5. Let's have a dream team of forecasters. Thanks.
When you score the history, if I understand it, you look at how far they are away from the truth.
Yeah.
But you could score it for whether they're above the truth or below the truth. So somebody who's an overestimator would be useful information maybe in the next epoch or something.
Yeah. So I'm sorry, would they be useful in what situation?
Well, in deciding their expert, that might be their bias.
Right.
And if you balance the biases off people that are under predictors and over predictors, as opposed to just how far they are away from the truth, it might have a different kind of history. Yeah,
right. So that's a good idea. So it kind of captures, I think, a little bit of what we may have been talking about at lunch, is that this strategy is based mainly on identifying the better experts. And we can beat the whole crowd, but this idea of diversity, I think, is really important. And we might want to get people who tend to make opposite errors. And so there might be a way to choose our top 5, paying attention, to performance, but also at the same time trying to get people who have been recently on both sides of the truth. So we're going to have to think of some good rules to apply that to implement that. But I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, just a small comment on the categories, like economic categories like GDP. Usually you have the first data, then you have a revision.
Oh, right, I'm sorry. Yeah, I didn't get into that.
The
So,
second revision, the final revision, which comes out the year afterwards.
right. So this is all based on the very first vintage. I know there's a preliminary vintage before this. This is based on the first vintage. We've also looked at the second vintage for some of these. It was the same. The problem is if you start to look into later vintages, the definitions of the variables start to change, and then everybody's forecasts become really, really bad because the thing you're measuring them on is not the same thing as the thing they thought they were predicting. So we decided to stick with the early vintages.
Yeah, and especially then, like horse races, like the Wall Street Journal horse race, don't make much sense because often for the second revision, the first revision, the second revision, the final revision, there will be a different winner.
No, that's right. Yeah.
And sort of the differences are too small, probably. But so the
that's a good point.
Is
yeah.
this a horse race about the first? I mean, so people, they are not. These variables are not like temperature.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And that's
well, some of them are. I think some, I forget, like some of them never change. I think like maybe it's the inflation rate. Some of them seem to be stable.
Yeah, but the inflation rate itself can be, there is one way of measuring inflation. There is
right.
That is the official way. These are not categories like they are like temperature, including inflation.
Right. My understanding, okay, yeah, I'm with you.
So it's not a criticism of what you are doing, But it's something different. It's sort of like, what are these trying to figure out.
So there's each variable has a definition, and my understanding of this is that the forecasters know what that definition is when they make the forecast.
Yeah.
And that if you stick with the first or the second vintage, you're making sure that you're comparing apples to apples. That the thing you're measuring them on is the thing they thought they were forecasting, which is why we stuck to the early vintages. Yeah. Yeah.
If you had an opportunity to choose different sets of experts based on their knowledge of the particular variable that you might be interested in, for example, some of these experts
Right.
might be experts in housing versus GDP, and
Yeah.
the expertise across the whole range of these things.
So we met, right. And so in our analysis, when we were actually implementing the strategies, we treated it that way because we looked at each data set individually and each horizon separately, right? So we assumed that there might be experts at predicting, housing 3 quarters ahead. And it might be interesting now to say, well, maybe there's some more general type of expertise and we should look at performance across, like this is actually the difference with the Wall Street Journal because they look at performance across all the variables.
Right.
So we could say maybe rank them based on everything. Or we could say maybe there's one set who are an expert at predicting 2 quarters ahead and another at long run, one at long range and one at short range. So I think there's a lot of different ways to cut it.
Do you see any advantage to that?
Actually, I don't know. I mean, do you have any intuition as to which is like where we would see the biggest improvement by taking the top experts? Are they general, or do you think it's more domain?
I don't know either.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if you had an idea.
Yeah. No idea.
Okay.
The one thing I can say is we've looked at the same variable, but looked at ranking them on other horizons, and it does not seem to matter much which horizon you rank them based on. So we could rank judges making horizons 4 quarters ahead, but rank them only based on their forecast 2 quarters ahead, and that didn't matter. We could have taken one or the other of those. Stefan.
So I was wondering, so I've been looking at the dispersion of accuracy and bracketing. But I was wondering what the effect is of the predictability of the environment. So in certain cases, there's less noise in the environment, and sometimes there's more. And there has been an interesting paper by Jerke Dennerl showing that if things are difficult to predict, somebody who actually predicts something very well that's unusual, it's very likely actually a bad forecaster because he or she just by luck ended up making a good prediction.
That's right.
And so this would also at least push away from chasing.
It would.
But I was wondering whether that would shift anything about this flat maximum, or maybe top 5 or something similar would also be robust towards changes in the predictability of the environment.
Yeah, I mean, I'd originally thought that if you just base it on a history of one and you take the best judge, you'll actually do worse than if you pick somebody randomly, precisely for that reason. That you might get a person who's sort of been chasing noise. That turned out not to be the case here, but it certainly, I think, makes a lot of sense. I mean, that if you look at the top group, why are they in the top group? One reason is they have skill, and the other reason is they got lucky. And one way to get lucky is to make extreme forecasts, and then everybody thinks you're a great forecaster once those extreme things happen. And if you're applying that kind of strategy where you're predicting extreme things, you're probably going to, on any random trial, do worse than just picking somebody at random. So it's interesting. I haven't thought of a way to...
Maybe kind of the pool of small people ensures you a bit against it, because it's unlikely that all 5 or 10 people are there because of pure luck. So maybe that's the reason why this works.
The 5 is kind of, yeah. Anything else?
So one thing I've tried with a large crowd is to make it into a small crowd by grouping people by similar characteristics. So is that, I'm just curious, is that analogous, would you say? Like if I take a large crowd and I say take all the, I don't know, the economists and the political science, I group them together, and so then I consider those as my predictors. In some ways, am I taking advantage of the
So are you trying to put similar people together, or are you trying to put diverse people together?
Similar people together into, and as if they're a person making a prediction.
Because they would have
similar biases.
Similar expertise.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. But then do you want to average across
and
different
average
people?
across the different groups of people.
Oh, I see.
as if they're like, so instead of having 1 million people, now I have 5 groups of people who each have an individual prediction.
Yeah.
And so I sort of have a small crowd.
That's great.
Is that a reasonable
yeah. Well, it's not what I did here, because what I did here is we take the top 5 and we ignore everybody else. And whoever came closest to the truth, we're going to go with that group. So it's really about identifying people who seem to know something about, let's say, the economy, how the economy is going for the moment. And that can change over time, and then we might get a different top 5. But we're ignoring a lot of people. Whereas it sounds like what you're doing, which I think is great, you're sort of trying to put people together who have similar perspectives, and then that group, maybe they have a discussion, or no, you sort of average?
I just average them.
But then you sort of learn, well, what is the guess coming out of that perspective? And then you get sort of a clearer signal about what that perspective has to say, and then you average across the different perspectives. I think that's pretty cool. Yeah.
Maybe I'll jump on the last question, and while we're discussing it, David could set up for the next talk. So I just want to check, when you said you had no ideas, you really had no idea, and that wasn't the executive summary. You have this nice way of characterizing an environment in terms of the bracketing rate and the coefficient of variation that you need to know the ground truth to measure both of those things, and we're trying to get at a method to do the ground truth. So is there any way of characterizing environments?
Yeah, I mean, I think
without already knowing the answer?
That's a great question. So I think what we've shown is that the small crowd is a great way to go if you don't know anything about the environment. And now we've got a little bit of history of some data. Can we type the environment? And once we know what kind of environment we're in, we might have a better idea about how to aggregate in that environment. So we don't have any results on this yet. I think it's an interesting question. Can you use that same history not only to rank the judges, but also to say something about what type of environment you're in? So I think that's an important, interesting question, yeah.
All right. Please join me in thanking Jack.
Thank you.